Is there a deal or isn't there? Over the weekend, U.S. President Donald Trump repeatedly signaled that an agreement with Iran was imminent. Well, now he appears to be walking that back significantly. On social media, Trump wrote, negotiations with the Islamic Republic of Iran are proceeding nicely. It will only be a great deal for all or no deal at all. Back to the battlefront and shooting, but bigger and stronger than ever before, and nobody wants that. The interim peace deal is meant to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and create a 60-day window for further negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. But in Tehran, too, the signals suggest a deal is not imminent.
No, we have no timetable or deadline for finalizing the framework agreement. For us, the criterion is the protection of our national interests. Whenever we reach a final conclusion in this process, we'll announce it.
Let's bring in Ross Harrison, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and author of Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for your time. Iran's foreign minister and the central bank chief, they went to Doha on Monday to negotiate a deal with the United States. Is this just theater, or do you think a deal is actually emerging?
Well, Sarah, I don't think it's theater, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a deal is going to be in the offing. I think that this is a very, very difficult negotiation. And I think the best that we can expect is some kind of preliminary framework and statement of principles that would then at least get the United States to end the blockade and for Iran to open up the strait. But then there are all sorts of other issues that separate the two parties. And I think what we're seeing is not theater, but the various political interests on each side. The closer the parties get to a deal, the more the political interests tend to come and try to spoil a deal. So you see that to some degree, a lesser degree in Iran, but you see some of the hardliners basically coming out and saying that there is no deal in the offing. There should not be a deal with the United States. You can't trust the United States. And in Washington, you have some of the hardliners in the Congress, and you have Israel and the Israeli lobby as well. So I think the closer you get to a deal, oftentimes it appears as if it's theater, but it's not. But also, I have to say that this is because of the factors I just brought to bear, this is a very, very dangerous moment.
Talk with us a little bit more about the American side of all of this, because, I mean, the war on Iran is seen as politically toxic right now for President Trump, with Americans feeling the pinch of higher gas prices and inflation. Does Trump have any good options for getting out of the war?
Well, not really, because, I mean, he does politically if he can finesse it. But remember, this was a war that was a war of choice of the United States. It was waged February 28th by Israel and by the United States on Iran. And the Strait of Hormuz at that moment was open. There was no, even though there was a lot of bravado and a lot of statements coming out of Tehran, the straits were open. About 130 ships were flowing a day. So shortly after the war started, the Iranians closed the strait, and then we have the blockade that occurred later. So removing the blockade and opening up the strait just takes Donald Trump back to the pre-war reality. And on the nuclear front, which is the other major piece of this, they were in the middle of negotiations when the war started. So I think the problem for the United States is that when the war ends and people look, American public and many of his opponents will look, and some of his allies actually, will say, what did we accomplish? Because if we go back to the situation between the United States and Iran, and Israel and Iran before the war, we kind of are going back to ground zero. So I think there are not any real good strategic options for the United States. But I think what you're seeing now is a bit of a kabuki theater choreographed kind of a situation where the United States is saying time is on our side. The Iranians are saying time is on their side. And I think what Donald Trump is trying to say is he's not desperate for a deal, even though he lacks real, very, very good options. One of the things I think is important for your listeners to understand is that there also are no really good military options for the United States. The Iranians could gain from some kind of resumption of conflict because their goal is to resurrect deterrence. For the United States, Donald Trump can inflict damage on Iran, but in terms of actually bringing Iran closer to capitulation or to somehow a better deal for the United States, I think that reality has probably hit the White House, and that's why you're seeing some of the momentum, but also stalled momentum at various times.
There's also a different aspect at play here, and I'd like to ask you about something else that Trump said, because he's also calling on more Arab and Muslim states to sign up to the Abraham Accords. These were, of course, brokered during his first term in office and aimed at normalizing ties between those states and Israel. He mentioned Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Pakistan, Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, and he called his request mandatory. What is the play there?
I think the play is that Donald Trump wants to extract a win from this situation so that he is not charged with just going back. As I mentioned, the strait was open before the war. If he opens the strait again, then you're back to where the pre-war reality. And if he gets a nuclear deal, it may not be any better than Obama had in 2018. And the Trump administration walked away from that deal in 2018. So I think what he's trying to do is to extract something from the situation in terms of getting them to join the Abraham Accords, which is not going to happen, by the way. I just came back from Doha.
That was my follow-up to you, because I mean, he said that Saudi Arabia and Qatar should do so immediately. You see no chance of that happening.
No, I think, listen, there was a move a couple of years ago during the Biden administration, even for the Saudi before the Ukraine war. There was an attempt to bring the Saudis. To bring the Saudis into the Abraham Accords. I think the U.S. misread that. I don't think the Saudis were really that ready to do that. But once October 7th happened and the Ukraine war started, that fell off the table. And I don't see the Qataris doing it. I think that right now, one of the reasons the UAE, which has gotten the brunt of the attacks from Iran, one of the reasons that they're getting the brunt of attacks from Iran is that they are a signatory, along with Bahrain, to the Abraham Accords. So I think it's a toxic situation at this moment. And I just don't see that they're going to bite under any circumstance, particularly when it's promoted by Donald Trump.
Okay, so, we've been talking about the pressure that Trump is under to get a deal. How about from the Iranian side? Do they have the power now to set the pace, or are they under pressure also? I mean, especially given, the turnover that we have seen with much of their leadership having been killed.
Yeah. Sarah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, listen, they're certainly under pressure, economic pressure and potentially kinetic military pressure. But I think their North Star, what they're focused on, is two things. One is making sure that at the end of this war, they have resurrected deterrence so that 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, this conflict does not come back at them. And that's something, Sarah, I think that most viewers need to understand, is that at the end of the June war of last year, which basically decimated or at least injured Iran's nuclear program, the Iranians believed they had lost deterrence. And they believed that war was a set up conditions for the war that we experienced in 2026. So their North Star, even though they're under pressure, they believe they have to, at any cost, reestablish deterrence. And so that's why that they act as if time is their friend and not their enemy. They're certainly under pressure, but they haven't come this far to collapse and capitulate, and they're not going to do it. And if that means the United States resuming some kind of kinetic action, I think they're willing to bear that cost. And I think in some ways they're saying, okay, if that happens, they can inflict more damage and reestablish deterrence even to a greater degree as a result of American aggression rather than through a ceasefire. So I think they're under pressure, but they have a very clear political and a set of objectives, and they're not going to capitulate. Certainly not going to capitulate, and they're not going to allow the war to end if they have not achieved that ultimate goal of reestablishing deterrence and hopefully some kind of economic lifeline as well. But deterrence is their number one North Star at this moment.
Ross Harrison of the Middle East Institute joining us from Washington, D.C. Ross, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
And I'm joined now by Fawaz Gerges. He's a professor of Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. Fawaz, it's good to see you again. So what are we looking at right now? I mean, is this a serious diplomatic agreement taking shape, or are both sides creating the appearance of progress because the war has simply become too expensive? I mean, what are we watching here?
Well, I think what we're watching is de-escalation and the management of de-escalation. Neither side wants to renew hostilities. And we think that major progress has been made between the United States and Iran, even though there are some major gaps still between the two sides. And I think even though there is no imminent breakthrough, I think if you ask me 1 out of 10, I would say 6 out of 10, we could see the outlines, the contours of an agreement in the next few days by the end of the week. So the reality is, I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I don't think we're gonna see return to hostilities or a new round of war between the United States and Israel on one hand and Iran and its allies on the other hand.
What do you make then of these repeated threats that continue to come from U.S. President Trump? I mean, is that part of diplomacy, or is that coercion dressed up as diplomacy?
Well, I mean, in fact, President Trump does disservice to the United States and his own strategy if he has a strategy. In fact, his repeated threats have fallen on deaf ear in Tehran. And at the end of the day, Iran has resisted. Iran has made it very clear that any end of the war has to come through a negotiated settlement. And here we are. You and I and the entire world is talking about when a negotiated settlement will take place between the United States and Iran. And I think the big point about President Trump's repeated threats, I think he confuses bluster and threats with diplomacy. He undermines America's standing in the world, and also he has undermined his diplomatic position vis-a-vis Iran. And that's why Iran has been able to turn a weak hand into a stronger hand. And at the end of the day, I think even there is consensus in the United States among Republicans and Democrats that Iran will re-emerge or emerge much stronger than it used to be before the United States and Israel launched the second war on the 28th of February.
Yeah. The reported deal that appears to be in the works appears to have two tracks. First, we have an end or a pause to the war and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. The second track would deal with Iran's nuclear program. I mean, does it strike you that we're talking about the first part of this deal has to do with the Strait of Hormuz, which was not an issue before this war began?
You put your finger on really on the pulse, on the core of the problem. For President Trump, opening the Strait of Hormuz for shipping is and was the most important priority because of the pain in the world economy, because of the inflation in the United States, because of the repercussions in terms of fertilizers, in terms of energy, on the US economy and the world economy. So he wanted the Strait of Hormuz open. And this is Iran's most important card that has been really playing since it basically decided to put the shipping in the lake. So the first part, really, the first phase of the settlement deal with opening the Strait of Hormuz for shipping, lifting America's blockade of Iranian ports, also a gradual lifting of American sanctions against Iran, and unfreezing Iran's assets. You have about $25 billion in frozen assets worldwide, including $12 billion in Qatar. Ironically, today, there was a high negotiating team in Qatar, including the chief of the central bank in Tehran. And I think what they were talking, the Iranians and the Qataris, is about how to unfreeze the $12 billion that Iran has in Qatari banks. So obviously, Iran got what it wanted. It wanted to deal with the first phase, to end the war on all fronts, not just in Iran, but in Lebanon, and then postpone the thorny questions, Iran's nuclear program, to the second phase, which will take between 30 and 60 days. And this is a major win, diplomatic win, symbolically and politically for Iran. And that's why many Republicans, pro-Trump Republicans, are terribly angry with the president for giving Iran this kind of concession.
Yeah, and it sounds like this deal that is in the works right now does maybe kick the can a little bit, postpones the hardest work, and of course that is dealing with Iran's nuclear program. Do you believe that Tehran will ever agree, though, to giving up all of its enriched uranium? I mean, that's what the president continues to say, is it's going to be part of the deal. No more uranium for Iran. Do you believe, though, that Tehran will ever agree to that? Is that a red line for them?
I don't believe that Iran will give up all its enriched uranium. I think this is a red line. And remember, Iran has mastered the art of negotiations. In fact, the whole culture of the bazaar was invented by Iran, open diplomacy. So I think Iran will try very hard to basically either dilute the 970 pounds of high enriched uranium, or basically ship half of the uranium to either Russia or China. And of course, Iran will insist on domestic enrichment, of course, lower qualities, about 3 or 5%, as opposed to 20 or 60%. So the second phase of negotiations is going to be very difficult, very complex. And I think there are some unbridgeable differences and division between the United States and Iran. And that's why I think many people in the United States, many Republicans and Democrats, are reminding President Trump of the 2015 agreement that was signed between Barack Obama and Iran. Iran shipped 97% of its enriched uranium. Iran shipped them to Russia. So imagine President Trump, really all President Trump would do is a deal similar to what Barack Obama had in 2015, if not a worse deal. And this is a nightmare scenario for the Republican Party. The big question, the Republicans are saying, what have you achieved, President Trump? Show us what you have achieved. And I don't think President Trump really has much to say on this particular key core question.
What do you think the chances are, let me just ask you before we run out of time, but the chances of renewed fighting? Because as you say, the nuclear question is being postponed, and certainly the Iranians know that a midterm election comes up in November. So the window of opportunity for Trump is closing. Does that rule out any further fighting?
Well, I mean, you asked me earlier about a negotiated settlement, and I said 6 or 7 out of 10. In terms of really another round of hostilities, I would say 3 or 4 out of 10. In fact, American military planners, we have information, leaked information, have told the president, look, we could destroy anything you want, but Iran won't change its position. We could not really force Iran to basically submit. So what's the purpose really of basically another round of hostilities if you're gonna end up the same way where you are today? And that's why I think the focus on diplomacy and basically cut his losses. I mean, President Trump is really trying to cut his losses at the end of the day. This does not really mean that Iran has won. Iran has not won. But the fact is, the fact that Iran has not been defeated on the battlefield is a win for Iran, but Iran has suffered a great deal. And Iran basically will suffer for many years as a result of the destruction of the civilian infrastructure that has happened in the past 3 months.
Okay. Professor Fawaz Gerges, it's always good to have you with us. Good to get your insights on a story that remains fluid and volatile. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to talk about the view now from Israel and how they come into play here. We're bringing in DW correspondent Emily Gordine, who is standing by in Jerusalem for us. Emily, a few details have come out about any potential deal. What is the reaction now from the Israeli government?
Well, the reaction in Israel is ultimately deep concern. What has emerged from these talks, these indirect talks, is deeply concerning to the Israelis. Fundamentally, what we know, what we understand is that under this new framework, Iran would open the Strait of Hormuz, the US would lift the naval blockade, but key issues like the nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program, have been sort of kicked down the road, and the ballistic missile program has, it seems, been left off the table altogether, and that's deeply concerning for Israel. Israel started this war together with the US with three fundamental, four if you want, goals. One was regime change, two was the dismantling of Iran's nuclear program, three was the dismantling of Iran's ballistic missile program, and four was the dismantling of Iran's proxy network. Now, none of these key issues, key goals, have been achieved under this new framework, and for Israeli leaders, especially in this election year, but also considering that Iran is seen as an existential threat to Israel, this is very concerning.
Most Israelis support the war in the Lebanon war. If Israel had to stop fighting due to a peace deal negotiated by the U.S. and Iran, we know that that is the precursor for a deal from the Iranian side. How would that go down with Israeli voters? Because, I mean, there are elections coming up in September.
Well, look, Israel is incredibly polarized and divided. A few weeks ago, if you looked at the polls, then you saw 80% of Israelis actively supporting continued fighting in Lebanon. And that's essentially what we've seen play out, despite a ceasefire deal theoretically in place. I wouldn't necessarily say that that Israelis are so inclined because they just generally prefer a military option. It's because they currently at this point don't really see any other option on the plate. But if you speak to some Israelis, they will tell you that, oh, well, maybe, you know, if we put more pressure militarily on them, then it could lead to some kind of deal. But so far, that's not on the table. And so for many Israelis, especially on the right, especially among Netanyahu's voters, they want to see and continued fighting. They only see the military option as the only option in defeating Hezbollah. So that would not go down well in Israel, and that's why Netanyahu has also continuously demanded the right for Israel to essentially defend itself and to keep striking Lebanon. But here we're really at the crux, or really the big question here is this point of Lebanon going to derail a deal ultimately, or will they be able to find a way to bridge that pretty big gap at this point?
To what extent is Netanyahu right now being seen as able to influence Trump's decision-making when it comes to Iran and when it comes to the negotiation of a deal with Iran? Could the U.S. make a deal without Israel's approval? What is the state of the U.S.-Israeli alliance or relationship?
Well, look, the alliance itself is, in a formal sense, intact. But Israel seems to have gone from, you know, a co-instigator or a partner in this war to a bystander, and that in the span of only a few weeks. So that doesn't sit well with Israelis, certainly. And Trump recently said about Netanyahu that, quote, he's a really good man, he'll do whatever I want him to do. And you can read that as, in a way, maybe reassuring, but you can also read that as condescending, and I think that might be that might quite well capture the current relationship between the two. Ultimately, they are good friends. They are partners, but with this statement, it's very clear who holds the upper hand.
There's speculation, Emily, that the Netanyahu government is considering further action in Gaza again to appease right-wing voters. What's being said there?
Well, look, this deal ultimately can cost, this deal between the US and Iran can cost Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government votes in the upcoming elections in Israel, which might be in September or October. And And that means the temptation to escalate the fighting in Gaza, to sort of shore up right-wing voters, to reassure voters that Hamas is still being targeted. That temptation is very real. And in the last few days, we've seen extensive strikes on refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps in central Gaza. Throughout the ceasefire that was signed in last October, Israeli strikes have killed over 900 Palestinians. So the situation on the ground is already dire. And with this deal looming, if you look at it from the outside, if Netanyahu and his government are perceived to be sort of losing in one arena, the pressure to succeed in other arenas, such as Gaza, will be higher. Now, that being said, the UN Human Rights Chief has already described the situation on the ground as a, quote, unrelenting pattern of killings. And he describes it as, a, quote, continuing disregard of Palestinian lives enabled by sweeping impunity. And if there is no stepping in from the outside, there is a real fear among humanitarians, among experts who've been watching what has been unfolding in Gaza, that it could get even worse.
Emily Gordine, thank you so much.